Hello, this is Rachel Heinbach from Piercing Through the Cacophony, and this is our second part of the series on anxiety. I'm holed up in our music room in the basement right now. All the kids are upstairs and it's a bit loud. So, last week I talked about and posted a video on reframing anxiety. So, if you've not had a chance to watch that, go ahead and do that. And then this week, we're continuing to reframe this concept of anxiety and how we're experiencing it in the present, but it's really an indicator of it's trying to communicate this compounding or this accumulation of stress or responses within our body. So it can come out in physical ways, it comes out in emotional ways. And we talked about that a little bit last week. But something I wanted to touch on this week is to talk about our physical responses, but to also look at very frequently, I think, when we see a child experiencing anxiety, as a parent or a caregiver, we might have some responses that come from a deeply rooted place inside of us. When we see a child having a moment of anxiety, whether it's in regards to school or maybe it's ongoing for months and months, right? Or years even. We often approach it from this problem-solving perspective. This goes back to last week with reframing anxiety. When we view anxiety as the problem in and of itself or the main exhibiting thing, then we're going at it in a perspective of trying to resolve that thing, that we're trying to fix the anxiety. We're trying to reduce the anxiety because often anxiety and the symptoms that come along with it are very inconvenient. Whether it's a child just acting out all the time or a child throwing tantrums in the middle of public or writing maybe the F word on teachers' property. Not that any of mine have done that. When they're exhibiting it in certain ways, or when we experience maybe a panic attack, or the inability to enter into a different environment or a different room or interact with people, or maybe you're queasy all the time, right? And so there can be these different symptoms or indicators that are often very disruptive and very inconvenient. And so when we're looking at it from a how do we reduce the inconvenience approach, we very frequently are missing out on the underlying root of what is contributing to that anxiety in the first place. But what often happens is, as a grown-up, I can look at myself and say, I get it. I have all these reasons why I have these stressors that have built up in my life, right? I have these, a common thread of experiences that have contributed to my anxiety and my responses then, and how my body neurologically, physically, emotionally respond to those things. But when we look at a child, we're often stumped. We think they've only been on this world such a short time. How in the world are they experiencing such visceral, intense reactions to things? It's just school. It's just green beans, whatever it is, right? And we can have this response that the anxiety behavior or symptom is very disruptive. And then often it's on top of other disruption. And then we think, how do we solve it? How do we reduce the inconvenience? How do we reduce the disruption? We might even have, depending on your family, your school, where you live at, if you're surrounded maybe by people who don't have a greater understanding of mental, social, spiritual, emotional connections, then they'll be labeled, your child or yourself might be labeled as having just certain behaviors instead of seeing the underlying root of what's going on. And so then we might feel that societal pressure, that family pressure, pressure from teachers even, to minimize the disruption for the sake of everyone else. So I wanted to give some background, I guess, for why kids, sorry, my laptop's a bit wonky, why kids might be experiencing such intense anxiety. Because I think if we can understand the beginnings of it and the roots of it, it helps us to have a more holistic perspective and then have tools for helping them and for ourselves. So when a baby is born, I'm not doing the sex talk here, but when a baby comes into existence and this child is born, right? We, if you've been looking forward to the birth of this baby, which some people are, and sometimes some people aren't, if we're honest, there are a lot of emotions that come along with it. Depending on the birth and the labor that happened, it could have been very peace-filled, right? It could have been very traumatic, but even the most peace-filled birth is still a intense experience, right? Even if there's no medical issues, no struggle along the way, right? It's still an intense experience. And then we have this baby that comes into the world, and they might have, you know, some reflux, or they might have colic, or they might just, skate along fine. And we had one child that refused to sleep and one child that loved to sleep, right? And so we can have these varying responses from the children, from the babies. But as our babies grow, as parents, we are also then growing into the role of caregiver. And it's not always without stress. A lot of times it's full of stress, full of relational dynamics between partners, of how do you respond to a baby when they cry? How do you respond to the stress of finances, right? Or physical changes that take place? And a lot of things are occurring. Then, as the baby starts to get a bit bigger, it's learning to explore and do all these things that babies are meant to do, toddlers are meant to do. But in their pre-verbal state, they're going about babbling and pointing at things and doing things and exploring things. But very frequently, and this isn't everyone, but very frequently, the parental response is to correct and guide, right? Don't touch that, not that, don't touch that. And it's the assumption that the child goes along with how the family's doing things. It's almost as if we fight for life to happen, right? And then this baby's born, and then we kind of treat them as this puppy. We utilize Pavlov's law, right, of teaching of responses, knowing that if they learn to do this, then this will be the natural response. And so we'll correct them this way and we'll teach them this way. And we don't, when a baby, I've seen, when they're just patting their mommy's faces, and then you see a mom go, "Don't hit me, we don't hit faces." Because the mom's responding to this theoretical 10-year-old slapping someone's face, not actually what the baby needs in that moment, right? And so we have all these methods that we go about in teaching children and raising children, but so often we're neglecting to recognize that a 1-year-old has very big feelings. A 1-year-old is learning how to express themselves in the world around them. They're also mirroring off what they see their parents do. They're mirroring off what they see their caregivers doing. If it is a high stress household, which I would say there are many of those in this world, right? The child, and ours was the same way when our babies were young, the child then is absorbing this environment of stress and environment of tension, and they don't have a way to articulate it or process through it. And as a parent, we probably aren't looking at our little 1.5-year-old and saying, "Oh my gosh, I was so upset right then, and I stubbed my toe, or I, used a loud voice, or whatever it might be. That might have been startling for you." We just assume that the kids go along with everything, not being impacted by it. Unfortunately, what happens is that then our kids start building up this well of stress inside of them. They're building up anxiety. It's the early threads of anxiety. what frequently happens then is that the child just meshes in with the family unit until, say, it's time to go to school, or, a change, a shift in pattern. And then all of a sudden, all their anxieties come out. And we'll say, they can't handle school, right? Or it's just pushing them over the edge. And our children then experience, say, stomach aches, or a hard time functioning in school, or not knowing how to read signals from other people. And we don't know where the anxiety is coming from. And I'm speaking from experience here. But often it's because our children have, for years, been absorbing different patterns, have been absorbing different things without the ability to process through it. This is one reason why imaginative play is very important. It's also another reason why narrating for your children, talking through situations, is very important. When you have a child who is, whether they're neurotypical or neuroatypical, and they might have also sensory responses to things, right? Highly sensitive responses, they then are going to be internalizing things in such a way where they have lived their little lives, their short time so far, absorbing yucky feelings from that discomfort with texture of clothes, to discomfort of texture of foods or loud noises, whatever it may be. On top of that, if the parent experienced this, if the parental unit did not know that's what they were experiencing, then we have not been talking them through, helping them process through all those things. So they live with this hovering feeling of, I don't feel right. I don't have a place in this world. I feel ucky all the time. And if I feel ucky all the time, I'm probably the problem. A lot of our kids who struggle with anxiety will also have these bigger, more existential struggles too, where they are questioning their purpose in the world, right? Where they're questioning, when do things feel right, or they have a strong sense of justice also. And too often, as parents or caregivers or grown-ups, we kind of push aside their need to understand the world around them, as well as their physical and emotional responses to things. One of the best things that we can do in reframing anxiety is to recognize that our children, from the time that they were in utero, because babies can hear, they can experience tension and all of that, they have been absorbing things along the way. And something that we have found of great value in our house with those of our kids who struggle with intense anxiety and have panic attacks and those type of things is to go back and talk through different situations, because it's like they have these hovering puzzle pieces around them that they don't know how to place them. And so we go backwards and we say, oh my gosh, what would it be like as a baby to feel like you never could sleep and you felt so uncomfortable and it felt like you were like throwing up all the time? What might have that felt like? Oh my goodness. And so we'll try and talk through and narrate things that we never did before. It might sound a bit goofy, but in doing that, we start to help our children to recognize that, first off, there's not something wrong with you. This is maybe just how your body felt. This is maybe just how the environment was around you at the time. And then we help start to weave together that part of their story. This is why now, when you have a hard time sleeping, it jumps back to that part where you felt lonely, right? Or you felt maybe no one understood you. When they're pre-verbal, they don't have the words to attach to it. And when we don't understand that they're trying to communicate, we also then don't attach the words to it for them. So one of the great things that we can do is to recognize that our children have been compiling a history of stressors, and that is what impacts their anxiety. as well as recognizing that we can help give them vocabulary, help narrate the story for them, help them to see how much their parents, maybe, or caregivers have grown along the way too. That then gives them the hope and the reality that if we can grow, so can they. But also to honor their feelings and their experiences, to say when they feel uncomfortable, draw their attention to what is that physical response in them. When you feel uncertain in school, do you experience butterflies in your stomach, right? Does it make you feel sick? Do you start to have a headache? Does it feel tight somewhere? And when we can redirect their awareness to their body, it helps them to stay rooted in reality. We don't experience dissociation as much when we're rooted in reality, as well as it helps them to start pick up on those cues themselves. When I feel butterflies in my stomach, I might be excited or I might be afraid. How can I tell the difference? And these are things that we can talk through with them so they can start to recognize when their anxiety is building and when it's starting to decrease. Last week, we talked a little bit about the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And this week, I want you to go read the story of the Three Little Pigs. If you can, I would suggest picking up the story, The Three Little Dassies. It's Jan Brett who has those beautiful illustrations, but her version gives a little precursor of the story that happens. It gives this narration of the parents saying, this is why we've never lived there, and helping them to narrate maybe the danger that was along the way. Because when we look at the story of the Three Little Pigs or the Three Little Dassies, we see that this wolf that was chasing them is very much like the wolf, or in her story, the big crow, is this ongoing fear that we are always going to get caught. We are always going to get attacked, like in the story. And a child who lives with anxiety generally has a pervasive feeling that there is something wrong with them. It's like a wolf is constantly chasing them from location to location to location. And so what we can do is help equip them to live in a stronger house, right? A way where they can live in a place where they're protected, where they can know their story, and then not feel like that wolf is breathing down their neck. So a great challenge when you read the story, whether you do it with your kids or just with yourself, is to read through it and think, what is the way, how might that pig be feeling in that moment, knowing that the wolf is chasing them? How could we help the pig to feel safe? How could we help the Dassie to feel safe? What are some resources that we have? What are some calming techniques that we have? And how can we also piece together our story to then know that that wolf, that crow, that memory, that experience happened in the past and isn't chasing us? Yeah. And so that's what reframing anxiety can look like for this week, is to look at maybe a pattern in your child or in yourself and think through maybe what was a gap that you don't know your story of, or what is a way that your child might be internalizing a fear that really represents a part of their pre-verbal experience that they need processed through. Now, we don't always get the answers for those unknown times of our lives, right? But we can still hold those feelings and those experiences with compassion. We can still say, wow, that would have been super overwhelming. I would have felt helpless in that situation, right? As a child who can't get out to find their safe person in the middle of the night, right? And even though we know a child stays in their crib and shouldn't climb out, it's not safe, we can still validate the feeling, that emotional reaction of fear or of loneliness that's occurred. And I believe that when we do that, we can then help equip our children and ourselves to help navigate their anxiety that occurs now in the present. It will help to reduce that sense of alarm and to reduce that sense of overwhelm that is felt. So, thank you for joining us this week on Piercing Through the Cacophony, and we look forward to talking next time.